I am so excited to have Marc Dunkelman here today to chat about his new book, Why Nothing Works, what's going on in America, in particular, why nothing works when it comes to so many of these questions around inequality. Marc is a fellow at Brown University. He's spent 12 years or so, I believe maybe a little bit more in DC, working for organizations like the Clinton Foundation. I was on the staff at the, Senate Judiciary Committee. And, I love Mark's book. I think Matthew Iglesias had also called your book the best book to date on the biggest subject that no one is talking about, which when I heard that, I was like, this is just kind of, classic Matthew Iglesias and also, this work too. And so I'd love, Marc, if you could start off talking a bit about the book and, some of its central message and why it, seemed to like resonate with so many folks and also why people aren't talking about it.
Yeah. Well, so I'm thrilled to be here and I'm thrilled to reach this audience. The book came about because like more than a dozen years ago, I was living in DC and commuted into New York. And I would say would terminate Penn State real rats warren, or certainly was then. And I was reading at the time for the second time The Power Broker by Robert Caro, which I'm sure many of your
Yeah.
listeners, readers will know, which is about Robert Moses, the most important man, most powerful man in New York between the 1930s and the 1960s, who built all sorts of infrastructure all around New York. And there's one particularly poignant chapter called 1 Mile, which is about his decision to plow a canyon through the South Bronx in order to build the Cross Bronx Expressway, which really destroyed, to the degree that people remember, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning, which is,
Yeah.
the story of the late 70s and the sort of sense that there was arson all over the Bronx as buildings were going up in flames and the whole place was becoming really the sort of quintessential urban wasteland. Um, uh, the Cross Bronx was largely responsible for that, not entirely, but like had an outsized role to play. And the question in my mind as I pulled into Penn Station was, why is it that as you read Caro, it's so clear that Robert Moses is able to do this huge project with everyone screaming no, including the mayor, not only the local communities, not only the people in the Bronx, but like the mayor of New York City is against it. And he's able to do the route through through the Bronx, with turning a totally deaf ear. So we can't say
Yeah.
no to this bad project. And yet I'm about to pull into the traffic to the second most heavily trafficked transit hub in the world, like at that time. And I think still today, like basically the entire, a population, the entire size of Baltimore goes through that block of Penn Station every day. And it's this sort of disgusting subterranean rats warren. Why is it that in the 1950s we weren't able to say no to a bad project, and 50 years later we can't say yes to a good one? And I thought, when I started the intellectual journey, I thought that it was going to end up being the Dolans, who were the owners of the Madison Square Garden and owners of the Knicks and the Rangers. And I'm a Knicks fan, and the Knicks have been terrible for years. So, like there was sort of a joke that everyone hates the Dolans, and I just presumed that the Dolan family was the reason that Penn Station, which is just beneath Madison Square Garden, had never been reborn. And as I went through it, I realized that it wasn't the Dolan's fault. Like, I mean, it was Amtrak and the New York State and the Federal Department of Transportation and the Long Island Railroad and the real estate developers around and the Dolans. I mean, everyone had a slightly different incarnation of what they wanted to do in that world. And the problem was that none of those entities had enough power to push through a final solution or sort of a complete solution. None of them had the power to say, look, these are the compromises we're all going to make. Everyone had a slightly different take on what would be the best thing for them and for the community as a whole. And I
Do you think some of
realized,
that, like this action and reaction then to, Robert Moses and sort of this, right? And I talk a bit about this in the book, right? This, like the, vetocracy, right? Our ability to try and, push back against ideas because we fear that, the Bronx might start burning again, that, those 5,000, right? Robert Moses made this choice to displace 5,000 families when he knew he could have picked a different route that could have only displaced 50 families, right? And so we have this fear maybe that that is going to occur again. Like, are we just swung way too far in response to that?
That's exactly right. The narrative of the book is that the reason we went from the Cross Bronx experience to the Penn Station experience is that we were so put off by the establishment being able to do what it wanted, and the establishment being able to sort of impose its will coercively on a population that had very little ability to defend itself. That we've inserted vetoes into the system sort of in every turn. And so all of the constituent elements in the Penn Station world all had some leg to stand on and say, no, we're not going to do this. There's going to be a lawsuit. I'm going to pull my funding. Everyone had enough power to say no, so that absent something that everyone completely agreed with, you couldn't get things done. And what I found is that is true in the world of housing, where we're not building enough housing. It's true in the world of clean energy, where we've got lots of opportunities to build clean energy, but we can't build the transmission lines. Then we connect it to the places where it would be used so we can get rid of carbon. It's certainly true in all, like, everyone loves to compare America to China on how much high-speed rail we have. Like, the way you get high-speed rail is to have straightened out rights of way to make tracks straight, because otherwise it's all curves that the trains have to slow down. And we don't have the means at this point to be able to push through the objections that local communities have. And so the reason nothing works is that we used to have a system where there was an establishment that Americans that revered, that could make these decisions on our behalf. That establishment then sort of made a bunch of decisions that we couldn't trust: the Vietnam War, urban renewal, DDT. You can go through the interstate system in some way, things that really compelled Americans to lose faith that the wise elders would make good decisions. And so in the 60s and the 70s, our orientation changed, particularly among progressives. And we said the challenge for us now is not to centralize power in the hands of people that will do great things for us. It is to protect ordinary people from what that centralized power would do to them.
I wish the answer were as simple as, if only the Knicks could be a better team, we would have better, transit in New York City. That would have been a very fun book as well. But I want to go back to, one kind of specific area that you had mentioned, which is around housing, right? And so housing in particular in New York City, right? The Bronx is the worst housing insecurity, of any county in the nation, right? So in the wealthiest city, in the wealthiest country in the world, we are not able to provide enough housing, for our residents. Can you talk a bit about like how some of these, this decentralization, the decision making has created a lot of this, housing inequality in particular, and what you kind of came across as some of those, biggest barriers to production?
Yeah, I mean, the old story is that someone like Robert Moses, who was not only the park czar and the interstate czar, but the housing czar, viewed the opportunity to use slum clearance or urban renewal and knock down whole communities of old brownstones and tenement buildings, with the expectation that, like, a developer would come in and build a high rise. And that that chapter in American history is really, particularly for those of us on the left, reviled at this point. It really got a bad reputation because, in many cases, like, these were functioning, vibrant, minority or marginalized working class communities, and like this um, sort of godlike figure,
Yeah.
self-described godlike figure like Moses would come down and just mow it down, and then send everyone packing with the expectation that that would be replaced with beautiful housing. In New York, remarkably enough, like, he takes down those neighborhoods with the expectation that the developers will come in, but the developers are all interested at that point in building suburban housing and big buildings. So the money is going to the suburbs. He is also building the highways that will allow those suburban villagers.
Right.
But white flight is essentially subsidized by the fact that we are destroying the urban core, and that with the expectations that people will want to live in high rises, and they don't. They want to live in these new suburban houses. So by the time Nelson Rockefeller arrives as governor of New York, he is frustrated that there are these whole blocks and whole neighborhoods that have been rubble for years because Robert Moses knocked them down. And he hires a guy named Ed Logue from Massachusetts, who is responsible for, among and other things people know, Boston City Hall, which is sort of this urban travesty of just this ugly um,
Brutalist. Yeah.
structure in the middle of Boston, not far from Faneuil Hall for those who have visited. It's a sort of a remarkable thing, but he gives Ed Logue the title of chairman of the newly formed Urban Development Corporation, which is a corporation that, after years of lobbying, um, Rockefeller is able to push through the New York State Assembly, and it allows this one state bureaucracy to override zoning, building codes, financial problems by issuing what are called moral obligation bonds, which don't actually have the full faith and credit of the state, and basically says, Logue, go work your magic and build a lot of different things. And Logue does a bunch of things. He builds Roosevelt Island for the first time that Roosevelt Island becomes um, and he builds things in Rochester and Albany and Buffalo. And eventually, among the things that Logue wants to do is build in Westchester County. And his proposal to build some affordable housing in Westchester County is so controversial that he is forced to, when going to a village meeting up there, bring an armed guard.
Wow.
Right, like people in Westchester do not want, the urban core leaking into their lily white suburbia, and so eventually two things happen. One is Rockefeller, who has appointed Logue, relents to like the people who are just outraged at the change that he's trying to impose. And then secondly, Logue gets essentially out over his skis financially, and he starts building so many things that for which the financing comes due before people have moved in and begun paying their rent.
Mm.
And so that's the beginning of the fiscal crisis of New York State that defines the later part of the 70s. Everybody remembers I Heart New York. That was a response to, Ford to City Drop Dead and the sort of notion that New York was about to die. And the Power Broker comes out in 1975 in the middle of that and it's sort of blaming Robert Moses for the terrible circumstances that New York City discovers that it's in. Um, the response bureaucratically to this is that the state legislature, which had authorized sort of under duress under Rockefeller, this Urban Development Corporation, says no more of this. We're not giving more power to the executive branch. We're going to create something called the Public Authorities Control Board. And every time a governor from henceforth wants to do a big capital project, they're going to need to get the approval not only of their own bureaucracy, but of the head of the Speaker of the House of the State Assembly and of the Senate
Yeah.
Majority Leader. So they call this the PACB, and it's like, in the 70s, it's not a big deal because no one wants to build in New York. But then you get to like the 90s when New York is coming back, and the 2000s, and when the Bloomberg administration wants to build the West Side Stadium, Shelley Silver, who's then Assembly Speaker, realizes that he can use this power born from the depths of New York's sort of decrepit 1970s to kill what becomes the New York City 2012 bid for the Olympics. So this is 2005 that happens. And later, it's the same law which empowers a single member to veto all of these projects that developers understand if they want to build something that has any touch receives any state subsidy, touches any state land, like you name it, they have to go up first and see whether they can get approval from these three characters. And absent one veto or having insufficiently bought that vote or whatever it is, they can't build housing. And it is like this system that is the reason that Amazon abandoned their bid for Queens and all the housing that would have come from that and all the new units and all the things that would have affected the market across the city. Because at that moment, the chairman of the Senate Majority Leader had handed his veto to the local senator who represented that part of. So that is one example of how over decades the reaction, right? It begins
Yeah.
with Moses with these grand visions of building big houses, eventually becomes a system where there are these sort of vetoes woven into the systems that people can't even see, and you can't get the housing you need.
So I saw one person ask sort of a question, which was how we can, think about this consolidation of power that we are now seeing right in the Trump administration and the federal government. And, this notion of, there is this universe when you have, a lot of power and aligned decision makers, that we can get housing projects done, that we can, build rail, we could, create the energy infrastructure that we need. And then on the other hand, like one of the, most powerful parts of American democracy and our thriving cities is our, power of checks and balances. And I'm curious, like, if you, in this work felt like, there was a, place or instance where we had kind of right-sized that balance. I think many people would say right now, the checks and balances are disappearing in a way that scares many people, right? I think, the examples that you just gave in New York City, or maybe some of those, veto powers went, too far, though I think, some folks push back on how successful many of those projects would be, though I think now many New Yorkers regret not having, Amazon in the city. And so like, how do you think about where is that right, balance in that process?
Well, I think you're right. You're also right to set it up as a dynamic between two poles, one in which its power is too centralized and you get Robert Moses, one in which I think we're closer to now where there are so many vetoes that nothing can get done. And you need to find some sort of balance between those two poles. Um, on the first question you asked, which is about Trump and the sort of fear now that he's just breaking through, he is and he isn't. I think, but the point I would make is the reason that Trump was salient or politically appealing in the first place was that government wasn't responding, right? And
Mm.
so the sort of the temptation on the left is to see Trump sort of taking a sledgehammer to all of these protections and saying, well, then we need more protections. But in fact, the protections that we had erected before Trump sort of presaged his rise to power. And he's coming down the escalator, and he's popular explicitly because progressives, when they have been in control, haven't been able to deliver. And so I just want to I want to argue that
No, I
our
would I would agree with that, Tim.
our veering into this sort of world where we are so frightened of public authority that we don't allow it to cook has sort of laid the red carpet for a MAGA type figure to come onto the
Yeah.
national stage. So
Or
that's
or
the
at least the golden escalator.
yeah, yes. So I like that makes us partially culpable. I think for where we are now, and it means we need to have a deeper rethink about how we do this. Um, there are all sorts of examples in our everyday lives where we see challenges where people don't agree on things and we find some way to move through it. I frequently, when I'm asked to speak, begin with a conversation about, I've got two daughters, and when my wife would come home from work on a Friday night when they were 6 and 9, she would often say, like, I'm just too tired to cook, and no one wanted me to cook. And so I would say, like, let's go out to dinner, and everyone would be all excited for like all of 5 seconds, and then we realized we would now have to enter into like the negotiations over which restaurant we would go to, right? And like our 6-year-old had a friend who had once had Dunkin' Donuts for dinner, and so like was always advocating that we have donuts. And then my 9-year-old at the time was like only wanted chicken sandwiches, And like my wife still thought like we were young and hip. So it's like she would suggest like the vegan place that's, selling, unseasoned quinoa, right? Or like whatever it was. And like, so you've got these three different opinions. No one cared what I had to say. And these three different opinions about where to go. And like, you have to figure out like, does mom always get to decide? That seems sort of high handed. Like, are we really going to go to Dunkin' Donuts for dinner? As a family, like, is that responsible parent? Like, what is the system? Like, we always manage to find a way, right? Buy off Helen with a extra large dessert, and some
Yeah.
place where they had a chicken sandwich and something healthy, right? Like we would find a way. Um, but like it took some negotiating, and Catherine and I had much more power than the kids. And so like as you say, like, is there been a moment in our history where there have been um we've gotten the exact titration right between centralized power and checks and balances. And I don't know that we did. I think that, you look at the New Deal, you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority,
Yeah.
probably that like that's probably the quintessential example of what I call Hamiltonian progressivism, which is centralized, sort of Robert Moses style progressivism working well in the sense that like here was a figure, David Lilienthal, who was running the TVA in the 1930s, who dammed rivers and set up, wires to poor farmers and reforested denuded mountainsides and created industries and really brought a really um, impoverished portion of the country back into the 20th century. Um, and that seemed to work really well. It's sort of remarkable. Like in the mid 1930s, The Nation writes like a three-part piece about how wonderful the Tennessee Valley Authority is. Like the nation that today is just deathly afraid of, the racism and what a powerful centralized government might do. So like there's an example of sort of a good Robert Moses. Now I'm sure that if you go deep into the history of the TVA, you will find things that are not so appealing, that they condemn certain land. And certainly we know that when they had federal workers who were working for them directly, and the whites and the blacks were segregated.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like there are ugly underbelly elements to the Tennessee Valley Authority, but like the amount of progress that they were able to drive in a short period of time is remarkable. Um, and it should be sort of at the pinnacle of what progressives laud when they think about what progressive government can do. And yet, today, um, when President Biden passed the bipartisan infrastructure law and it included $7.5 billion to put EV chargers in the places along the nationwide network of interstates where it did not make economic sense to put EV chargers. Like the presumption was that companies that were going to make a profit on this would put it in the places like along the New Jersey Turnpike where everyone is driving, Teslas and whatever. Like those are obvious places because you can charge people for the electricity. But like on the long route across Nebraska to grandma's house, like you're not going to get that many chargers. So you need a subsidy to build a charger there. And
Right.
Biden put $7.5 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And 3 years later, when he left office, only 58 chargers have been built. And like, it's the antithesis of what happened with the TVA. And it's sort of yet another example of how, the reason that happened was that like there were no federal workers as the TVA, right? There was no federal workforce of electricians who could go out and just build these things. Instead, the money flowed down to state departments of transportation that didn't have any experience building EV chargers and had to contract with private entities to build the EV chargers in ways that adhered to federal guidelines, and then pick the site. The sites had to be approved at federally and at the state level. And then once you approved the site, you had to negotiate with the landowner to put the thing there. And once you had that, you had to get the utility for which the state and the federal government had very little leverage to wire up that site when they were constantly being asked to wire up data centers. Right. Those are investor owned utilities. Like they're trying to expend their limited resources to draw, to sell
Right.
load, and like sending it off to some remote charging station that's going to be rarely used, but is crucial to building more EVs. Like the whole thing was a mess. And so you get to 58 chargers after $7.5 billion spent. And like between those two extremes is some sort of happy medium, as you say, where we get to a place where we are doing things in a way that gives people a voice when they object to what the federal government or some centralized authority wants to do, and doesn't render that authority so feckless that it can't push through an objection.
Yeah, and I think so much of that and sort of how we are spending money, not spending money, this part of America has transitioned to this world where we really try and empower, state and local communities with, pass through federal funds that, are sometimes, we're unable to really get those communities to do that work effectively. Like, is a real challenge. One part, as you were speaking, that, really started to, ring in my mind again, which I know you and I have talked about in the past, was, where this book and, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book of abundance, overlap and differ. I think it was your book came out basically around the same time as theirs, and so I'm also curious if you can talk about like one. I think it would just be interesting for folks, to be part of that. I feel like those two books were often, Why Nothing Works and Abundance were said in the exact same sentence, for months at a time. But this idea of right that Ezra Klein loves to talk about with like the $5 million toilet, right, in getting stood up in certain communities and sort of all the different contractors and regulatory reviews and organizations that, and utility companies that you need to work with just to get, this one thing set up. And I think, they also, I know you guys talk a lot, in both books about, similar types of legislation, in California in particular. So I'd be curious if you can speak to, one, yeah, what it was like, having the books come out around the similar time and being in that same conversation. And two, how you have seen sort of some of those conversations evolve and differences too.
So, I mean, it was super cool to have the book come out with Abundance because, Ezra and Derek are so well known and have these huge platforms and are helping to define, I think, for a lot of progressives, like they're thinking about what we've done wrong. So that the conversation after the election was not simply, that our messaging was poor, or like that we were not just completely focused on sort of the tactical things that we need a better call list, or we needed to fundraise more effectively, or right this or that. Like it was Abundance, I think, set the table for a conversation about what the progressive agenda should be, more broadly, and not just like how many more units of housing do we need, or like, but like maybe rental subsidies to the degree that they diminish our capacity to build more housing, or there are tensions within the progressive agenda that need to be resolved or at least addressed,
Yeah.
as before, that there are substantive things that we're doing wrong. And so to be able, like, I feel like very fortunate to have had my book come out around the same time, because like there are a bunch of other books. Jen Polka had a book that came out, Recoding America, a year earlier. At the same time, our books came out. Yoni Applebaum had a book called Stuck, which is about how the sort of diminishing geographic mobility in America has diminished socioeconomic mobility. And so like there's becoming sort of a whole, I mean, I guess you would call it an abundance literature, but like it is sort of it's a literature about whether beyond messaging, Democrats have sort of a substantive challenge ahead of them, that our governing philosophy needs to evolve as well. And I think that's a very healthy conversation to have. It actually makes you much more optimistic about progressivism, in the fact that we're not just sort of belly achy that we almost won this election or whatever. It's sort of we're fundamentally rethinking things. Um, you know, within our little world, or I guess growing world of people who are having this conversation, I think the question you asked earlier about, what is the proper balance between this impulse to centralize power and this impulse to be fearful of centralized power, which is in the heart and mind, not only of progressivism, but of every progressive individually. Like we all have an
Yeah.
idea of a thing where we wish the government just fix this. And another idea of like a fear, like in the world of reproductive rights, that government is going to come in and do something coercive. Um, and so like we all live with this. And I think we haven't necessarily thought through how we're both concerned about climate change, where we want some bureaucracy to tell the polluters to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. And we're also worried about civil rights. And we don't want, Boss Hogg or whatever it is, telling black people where they can and cannot drink, get a drink of water. And so like these two impulses are sort of intentional with one another, and we have to balance them in the right way. And I think it's good for us to think about them. My fear moving forward within this abundance world is that Ezra came up with, I think, with a phrase that many of us who live here know, called everything bagel liberalism. And
Yeah.
the idea behind everything bagel liberalism is that Democrats, decide they want to build a bridge. And then after they decide that they wanted to build a bridge, they add on top of the contract to build the bridge a requirement that the bridge be built with American made steel and with people who have wages that are a certain level, and that the environmental impacts be mitigated, and that the workers who are working on the building the bridge have childcare, and that be subsidized by the people who are building it. And so, you're adding more and more flavors to the bagel to the point where, like, the person who might build the bridge is like, I can't do all these things, or it makes it so that like the process of building the bridge is much longer, much more expensive. There potentially it doesn't even pencil out.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like that is a thing that happens. I don't want to dismiss it at all. When you hear about everything bagel liberalism, however, the impulse I think among those who are sympathetic to the argument is we just need to, you know, boil the bagel, right? Like we need to wipe off all these extra flavors and just get to the meat of it. And I understand why people say that, and I think Ezra is right to have pointed it out. My concern is that I would like us to develop a system that doesn't just ignore what the wages of the workers are, or ignore what the environmental implications are, or set aside whether there's childcare sufficient to make it so that everyone can work on the bridge who want. Right, right. Like those are all legitimate things. The question is whether there is someone who can say yes or no to each additional flavor and see whether it's reasonable. I would love for that bridge to be built with only American steel. If American steel is 5% more than, steel forged overseas, I think that probably taxpayers should be willing to pay that premium. If it's 300 times more, no, right? I would love for there to be healthcare and generous benefits for the workers, um, if it's going to be so much beyond, right? Like at a certain point, you have to negotiate on behalf of the taxpayer, right? Like you don't want it to do environmental damage, but like by the same token, like we're building a bridge and there are going to be environmental consequences. Really,
Right.
what you need to do is choose between different options and then have that choice be ratified and move forward expeditiously. So, you see in the legislation, the House legislation has just passed twice now in California about transit-oriented development and infill housing, new rights that make it so that all of the concerns, all the mishigas, all the hubbub about building new housing in a certain place can be essentially entirely muted, right? If you are near a transit line and you propose to build a much bigger building, that the person who lives in the lot next door who opposes that building really will have no ability to leverage or even to speak to their concerns about the effect it might have on their everyday experience. And like I think in most cases all of those buildings should be built, and we need to build a lot more. And but I am worried about the long-term implications of essentially saying we're going to ignore the concerns. Like that's moving a little bit too far in the direction of Robert Moses again and his turning a
Yeah.
deaf ear to all the residents of East Tremont in the Bronx. And the question is,
I share.
yeah,
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
well, I don't know that we've got, I mean, this is what I'd like to work on next on some level is creating some sort of mechanism whereby the people who are concerned about a project have an opportunity to express their concern and say it. And somebody thinks about it and makes a discretionary decision about whether it should go or not. It can't be the person that wants the project, right? It can't be that Robert Moses, who has proposed the project, is offered a is forced to spend a half day listening to people say I don't agree, but by the same token, um, uh, it can't be that those people disagreeing are the are functionally able to stop good projects because it's not in their personal interest.
Right.
So we've got to
I,
figure out some system, and I don't think that we haven't yet forged in our minds how it would work.
I share that same concern, both that we don't yet have the system and that we stand, at risk of, you know, pushing, too many issues off the table because we say, we just need to get, the bagel made, right?
Right.
Politics is for power. And Ezra, is very focused on like you either win or you don't, right?
Yeah.
In part, some of this is this, 0 or 1 challenge on this. And there is a part of me that's sympathetic to that, right? And that when we, aren't in power, we lose a lot of rights. That when we aren't strategic about that, right? We see the crumbling of our, democracy. We see inequality rise. We see opportunity vanish. And so staying, in power and the ability to do that and accomplish the things that you want to do is incredibly important. But the everything bagel is my favorite bagel. Like I love that bagel so much. And I choose it every time in my, baker's dozen when we get it. And I think there is, this way to think about what are the things that you do include and exclude. And I do think there have been some, initiatives. I think a lot about like the, in the book that I'm working on, I, write about the, Atlanta Belt line and that as a project that was, able to create, powerful coalitions and add in, not massive, instances here and there, but when people wanted green space, they said, here, here's a community garden. When they wanted historic preservation, they say, here's a plaque. And it isn't, the 300% increase in prices of steel, but thinking about the ways to, compromise, like, you said, as you negotiate family dinner, right? Sometimes it's just giving, dessert instead of fully going to, Dunkin' Donuts and thinking about what are those areas where you can find those, levels of compromise because yeah, I agree that it is this, and I want it to be right our reality that you can land somewhere on that spectrum instead of it just being this 0 or 1. Um, I was also wondering if you could speak, briefly to this knock-on effect that we had talked about in the past, which is what happens to workers when we see this transition, which is sort of as the U.S. has sort of moved away from so much more industrial right production to being much more of a kind of like service-oriented work. And the challenges that that has as well, because I think we think so much about like this public infrastructure side of things of when we don't have highways and solar panels and homes, but what it also means to laborers as well. And then we'll touch on the path forward right after that.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I think that the industrial economy withered some was that we didn't we stopped subsidizing and building, right? It sort of struck recently by um, the fight that Trump is having over rare earth materials. We have all those rare earth materials here in the United States. We just didn't want to mine them, and it's very expensive to mine them here because of the environmental implications of having a mine, but like and processing them as well. Like those are good industrial jobs that have been shipped overseas, and we can say for good reason or not. Like probably our air is cleaner because of it, but it has like that's a trade-off. Like there would be lots more building, like there'd be many more jobs building homes and high-speed rail lines if it were possible for us to permit those things. So there's great work done by a law professor at Yale named Zach Blisco, who found after a lot of research that a single mile of interstate is now was by the 1980s 3 times as expensive as it has been in the 1960s. And the reason was not because of rising steel prices, and it was not because of rising labor. It was because like the uncertainty over whether you get the permit to build the interstate in this spot was so much more fraught that the person bidding to do the project, knowing like the number of community reviews and the objections and the lawsuits would drive up the cost. And that's true, sort of across the spectrum of different projects. The same with housing projects, the same with transmission projects. Like those jobs, if we could handle sort of higher labor costs and all of these things if there was more certainty and fewer lawyers, right? Involved in the project. So I think the hope is that when you are looking at, I guess, what Ezra and Derek would call sort of an economy defined by abundance, there'd be more jobs and more opportunities to work with your hands. There'd be more well headed towards that part of the economy in ways that would be generally good. I mean, and then on the other end, more housing means that housing itself is less expensive. And if you have more high-speed regional train lines, this is a thing in Boston, is that we have very slow regional rail, and everyone's complaining about housing costs in Boston. Well, you can build more in Boston, or you could make it so that you can get into Boston from outside of the city at greater speeds. But to do that, you need to electrify the lines, and you need to build new lines. I mean, there are things that you could do to put housing that is not currently in the commutable footprint of Boston within it. And we have chosen not to do those things. So like the sort of the feeling of downward mobility in the working class, which I think spurred many to join in the Trump election victory, is one to which this, I think Ezra and Derek would call it a scarcity mindset. And I would say is sort of this, the fear that centralized authority will do things that anyone wouldn't, that almost anyone wouldn't want, but would probably benefit the community as a whole. Like those things have combined to both limit what would be good for the working class and to limit the ceiling of votes that the progressive mindset can win in any given contest.
Right. It's interesting that, so many, right, the workers that we had pushed out in these industrial jobs were also many, who found themselves rising up, the income ladder for years. And now as we are deprioritizing those types of projects that could give them that work, we are, instead hiring many more consultants and lawyers and lobbyists to kind of help navigate those projects, and it is having really big implications for the middle class in terms of work and wage. And at the same time, we're also not picking those right types of projects that could benefit those folks who are now having to struggle under lower wages. So we're burning the candle from both ends in many ways. American Inequality, we are very data focused in this work, right? We really like to, focus on communities. And so it's been so great, how many stats and stories you have brought to this conversation. And every single article that we have ends with the path forward, right? What can we actually do to address, some of these challenges of, trying to create more projects that create, opportunity communities that focus on this work of abundance. I know we've talked about a few of them already, this, Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian divide and trying to figure out the right balance there. Can you, lay out a few more as you see them about what things, either folks on this call can do, public officials can do, or community organizations can do, people at state or federal, levels, as you see it? Like, who are the actors that really need to take this ball forward?
So this may come as a sort of a strange answer. I believe that what's happened broadly is that we've gone to a world in which people like Robert Moses had ultimate discretion as to what the public authority was going to do. We saw what the effects of that were around the country, not just Moses, but like generally what the old establishment, as it was, had this discretion to make choices, to one in which we imagined that we could create process by which that discretion could be denuded entirely. And we would use various processes to make sure that we got to the right decision, that the highway was built in the right spot, that the transmission lines were built in the right way, etc. And that process basically was designed to replace discretion as the means by which we would get things done. So that we imagined on the left, and it's almost strange to believe we imagined it, but we did. We imagined that you'd get a process that would bring you an answer that had no costs, right? We did not imagine a process by which at the end of a whole bunch of studies, someone would make a choice. When someone does make a choice today, they are sued because the ultimate trade-off is one that someone else doesn't like, and that is because they believe the process was wrong. So among those who are listening, among like the sort of the core the core change that I think Democrats and progressives need to do is that when we are framing programs, is not simply to change the programs so that there is a new process for deciding, but to ask ourselves who ultimately chooses, right?
Mm.
One, to process whereby the local residents who will probably object have an opportunity to articulate what's wrong, where we understand what the environmental implications are. We are aware that this is a nationally protected place for endangered species, or there's a historic building that's involved, or that this used to be an Indian graveyard. Like those are things we should know them, and we should be aware of them. It doesn't mean we need an environmental impact statement for congestion pricing in New York City that is 3.5 feet tall. When you stack the papers, but we should know those things. But the question is, who is able to ratify the trade-off to say it is like, for this amount of money, I will work around this Indian graveyard. But if the result is $1 billion of extra expense for taxpayers,
Right.
maybe that's a compromise we need to make. Or maybe this one species which is endangered, we can make a new habitat for them elsewhere rather than preserve this particular. Or we need someone to make what are hard choices. In many cases, in Ezra's book, in my book, in this literature, we go through absurd examples. We built no housing here because everyone's afraid of whatever, right? And those are the things that make newspaper headlines and make interesting stories. The restaurant that says that there are environmental implications to building a homeless shelter nearby, when in fact what their real concern is that there will be vagrants in front of their restaurant and it'll impact their business. Like, that's the kind of thing that makes people angry. Um, and but the truth is that, like, in many cases here, there are real trade-offs that a progressive person will find hard to resolve. We want additional housing. We don't want additional traffic. We want, we care about endangered species. We also think that there should be an ability for people who are in some marginalized community to be able to get to town and to an economic base more expeditiously. Like, those are hard choices to make. There is no process that can completely obviate all of them. There is not an unlimited sum of money such that we can, pay to find alternatives in all cases. Like, we're going to have to make some hard calls. And the primary thing that I hope comes from the conversation that began with Ezra and Derek's book and with Yoni's book and Jen's book and my book is that progressives, when they are legislating, change all the rules, who ultimately is going to make those trade-offs? Like, who's responsible for it? Sometimes it'll be an executive branch official. Sometimes it'll be an independent official. Sometimes it'll be a federal, state, local. Maybe it'll be a commission. Maybe it'll be a judge. I'm not sure. But, like, absent us asking ourselves, who decides, I don't think that we're going to get to a place where we're able to make reasonable trade-offs.
That is such a powerful answer, and I think rings so true because we can really narrow our vision as well, just thinking about process and what are all the steps and have, we checked all the boxes on this process without centering both the outcomes, right, that we are actually orienting ourselves towards, and the stakeholders, the folks who are actually involved, who will need to live with those consequences, right, and that dogmatic focus on process can sometimes neglect that centering of the people who we actually need to have make those hard trade-offs. And so and I think many of the folks that you outlined, right, of are they, public officials or judges, what role do they have in that is so interesting. And I'm also curious, like, how we can create, roles for individuals or community organizations, right, or nonprofits in those processes, because I think often when we've done that in the past, they end up being, occasionally they work effectively, but often they're like lame duck voices, or they're only able to give an opinion without that opinion, necessarily being binding or followed. And so the ways that we, accomplish, those, roles and veto process and understanding in the process will, or moving beyond process, right, to voices of decision making will be quite interesting. This book is amazing. I thought it was fantastic. As I've said to you, like, it's embarrassing how many, dog years I have on my copy of it. But the work you do is fantastic, Mark. I know you're also like about to board a plane to California soon to continue to talk about like some of your new upcoming exciting work. So I'm looking forward to staying in touch and hearing how all this work continues to develop.
Thanks for a great conversation. Fun to talk about.
All right. Chat soon, Mark.
Take care.